Hi guys, Pebber Brown here once again, and I'd like to talk a little bit about, there's been a lot of videos out there where people are talking about scalpel picking, and they're talking about pros and cons of scalpel picking, and certain people have put out videos really putting scalpel picking down in a lot of ways, saying you can't play fast with it and all this stuff. Okay, let me reiterate here. Scalpel picking was something that came along back in the 1950s with, my hero jazz guitarists back then. You got Tal Farlow, and you got Kenny Burrell, and you've got a whole host of other guitarists, Jimmy Rainey, and all these guys that were the old timers that would play with their thumb and first finger like this, which is the essence of it. So people are saying you can't shred with scalpel picking. Well, you can. You can go thumb and first finger really fast. If you want to go really fast, you add that little touch of wrist into it, which turns it into SAROD picking or oud picking. SAROD and oud are similar in technique. So you're really just shaking your wrist along with keeping your thumb and fingers loose. So the mistake is when people do the really fast wrist picking and lock these two fingers together. It can be done, of course. There's a lot of guys out there who play with their wrist really fast. Now, one guy who plays really, really fast wrist picking is a really good guy, Troy Grady. He's got some great information on his videos. However, the one fatal flaw to the whole school of Troy Grady, it's like the fatal flaw of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Many of you guys don't realize it, but Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a martial art that's mostly grappling, right? On the ground, on the floor grappling, and the philosophy is that 99% of all the fights you get in are going to be, end up on the ground, so you got to grapple. Well, that's great, but the fatal flaw of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is if you have to fight more than one guy at a time. If you're in a back alley and there's three guys coming at you, you're not going to go to the ground and grapple with one of them, because the other two guys will kick the crap out of you when you're on the ground. It's just common sense knowledge, which they downplay like crazy. There's a whole ton of people out there who swear by jiu-jitsu. It's an incredible art, but you can only fight one guy at a time. You can't fight two guys at once with Brazilian jiu-jitsu. So how does that relate to picking? Well, if you've got really fast picking like this, right? What that works with is all the newer guys who are doing this shredding style, metal shredding style, where we call the soloing adjacent scale tone soloing, where you play really fast notes in the scale that are next to each other in the scale. So that's the essence of speed when you're playing with high gain, metal, everything. The whole thing about a forced arm picking like that, it's good for stuff like that. If you want to play, I can do really fast like this, right? I don't know, you can do it for a few minutes, whatever. But the thing is, though, what kind of music do you listen to, man? Are you only listening to metal shred guys that play adjacent scale tone soloing? Or are you opening up your ears and listening to other styles of music where these guys do other kinds of soloing, where you're doing non-adjacent scale tone soloing? Like if you're going to play against an A minor chord, of course adjacent scale tone soloing would be. That's a good way to play, really fast with a wrist or whatever like that. What if you're playing in this chord and you have somebody like a Pat Metheny style guy where you're 2 and 3 string skips. Well, all this kind of has to be more flexible then at that point. So if you're playing intervals, it's a combination of all this movement. You know, you're moving your arm back and forth, your wrist, and you're keeping your fingers loose. You're not locking it and doing the... And those guys like Tom Hess and Troy Grady, they're great, but they're steering you down the road of playing in that particular style of music where it's mostly adjacent scale tone soloing. Now, the workaround for adjacent scale tone soloing to non-adjacent scale tone soloing has always been a little hybrid action, you know, like you've got notes here and you play pick and finger. That'll work. You got to work on that though, because one, the pick tone is a lot different than the finger tone. See, the finger tone's a little bit more softer. And it's subtle, but you can hear the difference if you listen. So the whole idea that I'm trying to convey here is that scalpel picking was done originally... Can you guys hear me better now? I'm so pissed off at all microphones. Here we go. Scalpel picking has been done originally by these guys like Kenny Burrell. Kennyburrell. You know, look him up on YouTube and you'll see. Most of his videos are from like the 60s because that's when they had cameras, right? Not too many cameras were in jazz clubs in the 50s. But anyway, he had the scalpel picking down. And don't forget, you guys, I've been around for a long time. You know, I started playing guitar in the 60s. You know, Tom Hess puts on his bio that he started playing guitar January 31st, 1986. Okay, cool. But 4 months after that, in May of 1986, I was playing at the Montreux Jazz Festival in Switzerland. Okay, so you get the idea there. You know, I'd already been touring around in Europe and stuff like that, so I played at Montreux when he was born. So there's a lot of playing before that. And the playing that's before that gets digested because in the 60s you had lots of folk guitarists. Lots and lots of folk guitarists, you know, like John Sebastian, you know, Happy Traum, all those folk guitarists. And that was a big, big, gigantic field of guitar. If you wanted to learn guitar in the 60s, you went down to the local music store, which in my case was McCabe's Guitar Store in Santa Monica, and you took a class where they taught you how to play This Land Is Your Land and Kumbaya, and you're sitting there with 13 other people trying to strum G chords. I did that when I was a kid, and then I got lucky and had a neighbor across the street, Jesse Ed Davis, who showed me a lot of little pentatonic stuff when I was a young kid. And then thing about that is, you know, you've got this whole breadth of 60s folk music into Yardbirds, Hendrix, Cream. And then Yardbirds, Hendrix, Cream, you know, fans out into Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, you know, and then Black Sabbath on the periphery. Although Tony Iommi, even though his riffs were really, really spectacular and catchy as hell, he wasn't quite the same kind of quality player as Jimmy Page or Ritchie Blackmore or Jeff Beck. You know, those guys were pretty damn up there on the list, you know. But Hendrix was number one for a long time until, obviously, he died in 1970, which was very much of a tragedy. And then he left a void, which all these guys were trying to fill by being the best guitarist, you know. So you had a sort of an unspoken contest between Jimmy Page, Ritchie Blackmore, Jeff Beck. And then Clapton sort of bowed out of it, and he went down the road of Bonnie and Delaney and Friends, and then he formed with Duane Allman, and they formed Derek and the Dominoes, and they did Layla, and then he hibernated in his mansion for a couple years, and then he came out with 461 Ocean Boulevard. But it really wasn't razzle-dazzle lead guitar playing after that. It was more like the J.J. Cale sort of living on Tulsa time kind of feel that he was trying to accomplish. Whereas back in Cream, you know, he had the Spoonful, Crossroads, you know, those wild solos on the Cream live albums, you know, which I probably wore out a couple of records, probably at least wore out a couple of turntable needles at my parents' stereo were playing the Cream records. Seriously. And then, you know, all that's part of the bloodstream, growing up with all that, you know, listening to that every day, hearing that. And then the decade of the 70s. Well, what was the difference between the decade of the 70s and the music now is that almost every band in the 70s had lead guitar, rhythm guitar, bass, and drums. Four-piece bands were abundant. And keyboards, you know, every once in a while you see a band with a keyboard player. They were great too. And then you had a dominating keyboard band like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and then you had another dominating keyboard band like Yes with Rick Wakeman, right? So they were really, you know, influential on everybody too. But for the most part, it was four-piece rock and roll. Two guitars, bass, and drums. You know, that was what you heard on the radio. That's what was available in record stores. You know, we used to go to Field of Zod and Rhino Records, and that was, all the records, you know, were four-piece rock bands. Everybody was coming out with albums. You know, I bought up as many as I could with what little allowance money I had. And then, you know, just growing up and listening and breathing in and going to all those concerts, sneaking down to the front row, you know, and then breathing and living and going to see Johnny Winter at the Santa Monica Swing and watching outside the Hells Angels get in a fight with somebody, you know, and then all those events happen and all that experience, you know. That's what kind of shapes your approach to playing music too, is, you know, living through eras of music, right? So here comes 1986. I'm already playing in jazz bands and soloing over jazz changes, and then Tom Hess was born in 1986, right? Or started playing in 1986. So that gives you a little perspective. So his whole thing is more based on guys learning metal and shredding. Nothing wrong with that. I'm not knocking Tom Hess. In fact, I'd like to take a few lessons from him to see some more angles on, you know. I mean, you can never stop learning. I've taken lessons up until recently with different people, you know. The most notable, I would say, would be Steve Travato from USC and the jazz guitarist Rick Zunigar out in L.A. Although he didn't like the fact that I posted a lesson video of his on YouTube, and he got really mad at me. Whatever. It was actually getting him some leads for lessons. He didn't see that. Anyway, so the point here is that the Scalpel Picking is from all those jazz guitarists in the 60s. Now look how I do it. I'm doing it like loose, thumb and first finger, but I'm turning the wrist a little bit here. I'm not doing the Kenny Burrell only moving the fingers. I'm doing the tiny movement here, which is good for adjacent single note soloing. Adjacent tone, scale tone soloing, where the tones are right next to each other in the scale, like this. And that lends itself really well to, you know, directional picking, economy picking, directional picking, all those kinds of picking those guys talk about. That kind of solo, it lends itself really well for that kind of stuff. Like, I just saw Tom Hess' video where he's talking about a pentatonic scale. So you're going down, up, and then down, I think. I'll have to watch it again. But anyway, he was doing a simple pattern which works really well with a pentatonic scale. But then, you know, the kind of music you listen to. I mean, have you guys listened to Pat Metheny's music? He does a lot of wide interval spreads. Another guy that's a really wide interval player was one of my teachers, was Joe Diorio. And I took lessons from Diorio back in the 70s. The way it worked was this. Howard Roberts, I took lessons from Howard Roberts back when I was in high school, like 1974, 75. Howard was forming the Guitar Institute of Technology. Tried to get me to go to his School of Guitar Institute of Technology. I was not quite old enough to, you know, get a car and do all that stuff and drive out to Hollywood and do that. So I was taking lessons also locally from Joe Sandino. And Joe Sandino told me about economy picking and directional picking and all that stuff. And Howard Roberts, he had alternate picking and directional picking, and he had all the picking styles totally down. He knew what he was doing at all times, and he could swap back and forth. And his philosophy was similar to what I'm telling you guys, is that you got to let the sheet music dictate the way, the technique that you're going to use. Not just develop a hard mindset of just, I'm going to only do this. But what if the music jumps around like this? So you got to jump around some more, huh? So all that really fast stuff that you've been practicing on 2-string, out the window it goes, because you got to focus on executing the sheet music that's in front of you. It's a different world, right? Troy Grady's got some endless awesome videos, but he's still doing the really almost stiff arm style himself personally, which works for him, which great. He's fast at it. But I mean, I think that if you take all these styles from all these guys that you learn from, Tom Hess, Troy Grady, excuse me, and then whoever else, and you don't just say, well, it's this guy, this is yes or no, on or off, it's either my way or the highway. But if you develop the approach where, yes, I want to include that information in my arsenal. Yes, give me that information. Yes, I want that. I want it all. I want all my stuff, collection of ideas from all these different guys that I keep in my arsenal, which is more my approach than anything else. So I'm not a Nazi scalpel picking guy or SAROD picking guy or whatever. No, I'm just saying those are the different techniques that I can show you guys. But the music itself should dictate what style of picking or left-hand fretting you're going to use. Now, I just had a guy lambaste me over my 36-minute long rock phrasing volume 5B, because I was bending notes and my thumb was up here, right? Well, there's a lot of videos where I talk about classical technique with the thumb back here, but there's also a lot of videos where I talk specifically about when you're bending notes, if your thumb's back here, it's not as easy to bend notes or put vibrato on until you're up here. That's the technique. It's called rock or blues technique. I've talked about it dozens upon dozens upon dozens of times, but guys only get their blinders on and they see, oh, his thumb's over the top of the neck. Isn't this the guy that talks about putting your thumb behind the neck? Yeah, I'm the guy. But that's for playing scales that are 3 notes per string. 2 notes per string would be pentatonic, right? Less strict. You could do this. Vibrato. Your thumb's up there. You can put a good vibrato on, so bend the notes. Pull it down like Jimmy Page. And your thumb goes up there. But the trick is, you got to be able to go back and forth and back and forth. Just like you got to be able to go like this, to this, to this, hybrid, SAROD. All these styles, you want to learn all these styles. And then use them when it's appropriate. So my hat goes off to Tom Hess. My hat goes off to Troy Grady. I would love to get involved with either one of those guys at some point in time. It'd be great. I could learn a lot, I'm sure. I'm not putting anybody down. Everybody is trying to contribute what they know. And if they know a certain bandwidth of stuff, well, that doesn't mean that's the only way, right? There's other guys that have different approaches. Now, what about this jazz guitarist that everybody knows about, Pat Martino? Ooh, probably one of the greatest jazz guitarists that ever walked the earth. How does he pick? Whoa, his picking style is very clumsy looking, very unorthodox looking, as is Pat Metheny. He holds the pick with the sharp end here, and he holds it with 2 fingers, and he plays like that. So, and a lot of upstrokes. Okay, another guy who's just ripping shred picking guy is Steve Morse. Well, you watch his right hand, and he goes through some weird contortions on how he holds the pick. So everybody's going to pick the way they pick. Let the sheet music in front of you, or the music that you're playing, decide what technique you're going to apply to it. If you're going to do adjacent scale tone soloing like this, you can use that fast stiff arm stuff. But if you're going to skip notes, you got to jump around more. So you got to, that movement is more over here than anything else, jumping around with the elbow. So you have to be flexible. You have to move around according to what the music is going, what's going on with the music. So anyway, all these guys that are knocking scalpel picking, so you can't play fast with it, they're missing the point entirely. They're not opening themselves up to the overall picture of it. The overall picture of scalpel picking has been extended since Kenny Burrell. It's scalpel along with the wrist. So it's scalpel, but using the wrist at the same time. So you can get it really hummingbird fast. And that together constitutes the modern electric guitar SAROD technique. Simple as that. So when these guys start saying, you don't want to pick scalpel picking, you don't want to do that, and you only want to do a directional or economy picking. Well, directional picking and economy picking are those kinds of picking styles where you go down, up, down, down, up. Okay, Tom Hess said it himself. You have to plan ahead what you're going to pick to execute it right. Well, if you're soloing over any kind of jazz changes or whatever, I think it's a little too hard to plan ahead like that. Now, one guy who could probably do it would be Frank Gambale, and he's like the king of, economy picking, sweep picking, directional picking, whatever you want to call it. He's miles ahead of all these guys, and he could probably solo over complicated jazz changes with directional picking. But, how many of us are able to get to that level? Seriously, that's pretty hardcore. But you gotta adjust your picking style to what you're playing, And to say that scalpel picking is no good because you can't go fast with it, totally missing the point. Totally missing the actual technique of modern scalpel picking. They're looking at the old scalpel picking, They're saying don't do this. When I'm saying practice this so you get used to moving your fingers. Two opposite approaches. They're saying don't do it, and I'm saying do it so you get used to it. But what I'm saying is this is not the be all end all. This is a start of learning how to glide fluently over the string. That's all I'm saying. All right, you guys. Until next time, Pebber Brown over and out for now.